I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to ThinkRadio.
People will go to exactly the same scene and see something completely different. And light and shadow plays a role, but it's the way you interpret that scene. And it's not an exact science, so you're not trying to record reality.
That's from my recent conversation with photographers Francie and Allan Ivey. We talked about the art and philosophy of capturing the world on film, or these days in pixels. It's a conversation you don't want to miss on this episode of ThinkRadio.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a ThinkRadio supporter, visit kbut.org.
Allan, Francie, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's nice to be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. I have a feeling that no matter where you go, I think particularly in the Mountain West, any little town has got an Allan and a Francie with a camera attending just about every event. You can find them at the rodeo, at the parades, just like you, documenting the life of the town. And I find that a really interesting role that you play. And so I'm fascinated to know how it is that you got here. How you, of all people, came to be in Gunnison, Colorado, playing this role of sort of documentarians of the life of this community. You're not from here.
No.
No, we can tell that as soon as you say the word no, practically. Where are you from?
Well, I'm from South Africa. Francie's from Zaire originally, then Zimbabwe, and then South Africa. And we moved out of South Africa in 1999. We moved to England, and we lived there for 9 years. And then we moved here. And it was completely by mistake. I mean, we didn't ever plan to come to Gunnison. We wanted to originally go to Arizona, and we came out and looked at a campground in Durango. And for a couple of reasons, it just wasn't going to be what we were looking for. And we came into Gunnison to look at a campground and spent an hour and a half here, had a coffee at the Bean, went back to England and put an offer in. And
that's all it
took.
Yeah,
5 months later we were,
They must have really good coffee at the Bean.
They didn't actually have that good coffee then.
but it was a good place to sit and think.
Yeah, we loved the area. We fell in love with the area, and we came out in October of 2008.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Why did you leave Africa?
Political reasons.
Yeah, we were ranching originally in South Africa, and our ranch was expropriated as part of the redistribution of land from whites to blacks. And so we decided rather than start again there, we would start somewhere else where we weren't at risk of losing whatever we had.
Was photography already a part of your life then?
It was part of mine, yeah. I've been taking photos since I was 21.
Uh-huh.
And so we've been doing that ever since then.
So you were a rancher photographer?
Yeah, a ranching photographer.
So what was it then about photography that captured your imagination that made you want to do that also?
I've always loved photography as a form of expressing myself. I'd like to be able to paint, but I'm rubbish at it. So I picked up the camera, and that's what I use as the way to express myself.
Express what? What are you trying to say? What are you hoping
Whatever's
to say?
going on in my head.
Yeah.
I've been fascinated by recording different cultures and different environments they live in, and how environments shape people and how people shape the environment. And so that's what I've been doing ever since then.
And so when you first picked up the camera, what was it that fascinated you the most? What did you, couldn't wait for the weekend so that you could get in the truck and go shoot? What was it that drew you out?
Mostly people. My passion is photographing people. And then I also like photographing landscapes. The real challenge is photographing people.
Why do you say it's a challenge?
Trying to portray people in the environment and trying to get to actually see inside them rather than just a superficial record of who they are and what they do.
Francie, how about you? Were you scooting around with a camera at that time also?
No. I did go with Allan pretty much everywhere, but usually I would just take a book and go and hang out somewhere under a tree and wait for him to be done. I only really got going with photography in 2012, so since Gunnison, basically.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
it kind of started because I would point things out to Allan and say, can you get a photo of this? Oh, get a photo of that. And then he would, but then I'd look at the photo and it never was what I had seen. And eventually he got a bit tired of that and just upgraded his camera, and I got the old one and I got going with that. He said, yeah, just get your own photos now.
What was it about those photos that you can say wasn't what you saw?
Everyone sees the world differently, and we can look at exactly the same thing and see something else, something different. And I think that's, Allan has a much bigger vision. Mine is a little bit narrower, more detail maybe. That's why he's really good at landscapes, and I'm better at more close-up stuff, just a smaller angle.
So from an artist's point of view, from an interpretive point of view, what do you think that means, that we all see things differently? And when you see something differently from Allan, how is that a different story that you're telling? Not just a different way of framing an image, but is there a difference in the story that you see when you look at something?
Yeah.
Very definitely. You photograph from your heart. You don't just photograph superficially. There's a lot more going on than just looking through the camera and taking a photo.
Describe it. When you first look at the scene that you want to capture, what is that process like of getting out of that just mechanistic framing it and photographing it from the heart? What is going through your head at that moment?
When you look at a scene and the longer you photograph, the more attuned you become to what you actually see and what you want to compose. And photography as an art form, you basically constraining the image to the borders of your photograph. Mm-hmm. And so every little element in that image is important to the whole. And when you look at an image, when you look at a scene, you see it differently. And I've seen that over and over, taking students out on workshops. They'll get to exactly the same scene and see something completely different. And Francie does that all the time. So
how do you explain that, Francie? I mean, what is it that's different?
I think different things call different people. Not just the colors and the actual physical scene that you're photographing, or even people. Mm-hmm. I think you're called to different things, and sometimes it's almost unexplainable why you're drawn to a specific image. I know Allan, quite often, he knows when he's taking the photo, he knows what it's going to look like when he's finished with it. Much more than me, and maybe that's because he's been doing it for like 100 years. It feels like.
Really?
Well, there is some gray in your beard, and I can say that because there's gray in my beard.
I don't know. I think that there's a connection with the environment that we're in, and that connection, even though it's the same vibration, but we all vibrate at different speeds, and so we connect with a different vibration in the same moment at the same place.
Right, and vibration is such an interesting word in this context because we're talking about light.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about the way the light comes off of a person, a landscape, whatever it is, an animal. Maybe you can think of a time where you were both photographing essentially the same thing. What called to you out of that scene versus what called to you? Are there examples that you can give of something that will jump out at you that just simply wouldn't jump out at Allan?
I think it happens all the time. Practically every time we go to a location together, we'll get different photographs. I think also there's this certain amount of interpretation that changes the way the image looks in the final product. I particularly, and Francie does it to a large extent as well, when you see a scene and you photograph it, I already have the end product in my head. Mm-hmm. And then it's using the camera and the software and so on to interpret what I saw. And there's light and shadow plays a role, but it's the way you interpret that scene. And it's not an exact science, so you're not trying to record reality. That's not the process. to some extent you're recording reality because it's fairly detailed, but it's your reality. It's not everybody's reality.
Which sort of brings us to the separation between photography, the way you practice it, and taking a lot of pictures the way most people practice it. Everybody's got a camera in their pocket now.
Yeah.
But that does not mean everybody's a photographer, because those people literally, most of the time, I can't say all of the time, all they really want to do is capture reality, capture what's right there so they can remember it.
Well, actually, I think everybody is a photographer because they have the tools that make them a photographer, but whether they're an artist or not,
I see, okay.
To me, that's where the difference is.
All right. How would you define that difference? If somebody's going to say to you, well, how do I know if I'm an artist or just a recorder of reality?
It's not tangible, I don't think. I think it's what's going on, what your emotions are, what you actually interpret in a scene, what you're trying to convey. And I think it's different in that we create something that we want to put onto a solid medium that we can then sell. And that process forces you to create something different. I mean, you're not just recording. There's the other elements that you're trying to incorporate in your image.
Well, and so a piece of art generally has the quality of evoking some emotion, right? Would you agree with that? I would love to hear from you, being the artist on the ground. If I purchase one of your photographs and it makes me feel this expansive feeling about the beauty of the earth, for instance, there are other things.
Sure.
Did you feel that to begin with when you're looking through
it
the
may not
viewfinder?
have been exactly the same feeling. I think you're really successful if what you felt at the time of exposure is what the person who's buying your piece of art feels at the time that he sees it. I think then you've probably achieved the ultimate, because then you're conveying what you felt, and it's recognized by the person who's purchasing or looking at your art.
And yet we've just gotten through saying that everyone sees things differently.
Sure. Yeah, but
so have you had this experience where someone looks at a piece of art and feels something completely different?
Oh yes, yeah, and that's also an interesting one, because I think that then you achieve more levels than you actually set out to achieve. Because if you go to creating an image feeling that this is a real quiet image, a real relaxing image, and someone else looks at it and has a completely different emotion, that in itself is a success. It's a bonus.
You just want them to feel something.
Yeah.
Francie, when you pick up a camera now, what are the things that your eye just hones in on?
Kind of depends on the day. For me, rather than like the big image, it's more the internal. So I like from inside the forest rather than from above looking at the forest, which is more kind of Allan, although he does both. He does everything so well.
And what does inside the forest mean? How do you do that?
I think that's my place. That's where I like to be, and that's kind of what I want to share with people, is that angle of the world rather than the huge overlook of the world or the environment.
And why? Why do you think that's important?
Just because it's important to me, and that's what makes me feel good and alive and quiet and peaceful and at home.
And you can get that through the lens of a camera.
Well, I attempt to.
Yeah. Well, you're still doing it all the time, so I'd have to say there's something about it that really appeals.
Yeah.
So let's shift from art for a second to where this leads us philosophically. All of that you've been talking about, this idea that we all see things differently, we see the world differently. Clearly, you've demonstrated that's true when making art. What can you say you've learned about that just in living life? It's not as though we turned that particular facet of our mentality off when we're sitting in a political meeting, or when we're at a family gathering, or when we're downtown having dinner with friends. We're still all seeing the world differently. And what has your practice of art taught you about community and how that works in general?
The most important thing is actually accepting differences, accepting someone else's point of view, accepting someone else's position in that society, in that community. We're complicated creatures.
Well, that's an understatement. That is saying something.
Yeah.
Francie, do you think that that is a role that art in general can play in society, is to help us see differences more than similarities?
I think it's the opposite. I think as an artist, you want to bring the similarities to the table rather than the differences, but you have to accept the differences in order to see the similarities.
I'm Alan Wardus, and you're listening to Think Radio on KBUT. With me today are photographers and philosophers Francie and Allan Ivey. So we've talked about the difference between landscapes and people. You shoot landscapes. Allan, you said you really want to be shooting people.
I'd like to do both, and I do both. And I think the landscape bent is more about economics. The whole photographic art scene has moved away to a large extent from people. We wouldn't be able to make a living shooting documentary-style people in Gunnison. We have to do both. So although that's why we are at the events and the rodeos and the parades and all that sort of thing, is that we try and capture what's actually going on. Shooting people is more dynamic. Things are changing, and you're trying to capture people as they are. You're trying to look into their soul. Whereas landscape, it's almost more therapeutic. In landscape, you might have a couple of minutes or more to capture a particular image, whereas with people, it's
nobody stands still that long.
No.
As you said, we're complicated.
Yeah, and you'll see something that you want to capture, and it's usually very fleeting, and so you've got to be familiar with your gear and your equipment, and you've got to try and get that when you see it. So it's more challenging.
Francie, do you ever feel slightly voyeuristic shooting people in their activities at the rodeo or the parade?
I'm not sure about that. Certainly different things kind of affect me differently, and I think we're lucky in this valley that there's such a varied bunch of people. I mean, we go from the ranching community where we do the rodeos to going up to Crested Butte, and you have the Vinatoc events and that kind of thing. I think every now and then you have to stop and kind of figure out, well, where am I along this line? And sometimes we are just recording the event, and other times we are definitely part of the event.
And what sets those two apart?
Just the emotion at the time of shooting.
So give me an example of a time when you were completely caught off guard and swept up in the emotion of something that you were shooting.
The main one is probably the one moment during a cattleman's parade when I took a photograph of a little boy. We've never been able to find out who he was. Just the empathy and the feeling that he made me feel, just his little face, and he was just so sad. And for him, it might have just been just because someone else grabbed the candy before he did. But I think there was more to it than that. There was stuff going on in his little life, and I just happened to be right there at that moment. But I made a connection with him, and it's once in a lifetime.
Allan, what's your favorite story that erupted, so to speak, in the moment that you pressed the shutter and captured a slice of somebody's life?
There's so many. I don't know that there's one single one. I think every now and then you capture something that there's complete harmony, there's complete balance. It's frustrating that it doesn't happen as often as you'd like it to, but it happens. I think pretty much every time that we've gone to an event, we've captured something that's unique.
How do you think the world is different now because everybody's got a camera in their pocket? In your lifetime of shooting photographs, and even going back before that, how is the world different now because we have the ability to record through hundreds of lenses, perhaps, what's going on at a particular time and place?
I think the difference mainly is the permanence. I think most photographs are not permanent. Just a fleeting moment that people will share on social media, and then within seconds you onto the next one. I think there are so many more images being created. I look back at my career, at times I would shoot with a 4x5 plate camera, and if I took 12 images a day, which is what I had backs loaded to do, it would be as many as I took on a day. Nowadays, I go out in a single morning and take 400 or 500 images. And if the light is changing and things are moving and there's a lot more subject matter, you take even more. A rodeo, we might take 2,500, 3,000 images on a night. And that's each of us.
And so back when 4x5 plate photography was all there was, the value of a single photograph was much larger.
Now and also I think the aim of recording with those cameras was more to create an end product. So few people print now. It's very transient, whereas 15, 20 years ago, you would create an image and the next thing you would do would be print it. And it would be tangible. It's much more fleeting now.
Yeah.
It's made things speed up. It makes life go faster, the way the instant images like we have now with the smartphones and social media. It's like Allan says, you take a photo, you put it on, and then that's it. You have to get the next one up because now everyone else has seen that. You have to go to the next one. Whereas before, it was a much slower process, and you could actually almost feel more during the process than maybe we do now.
Because you're not in such a big hurry to get on to the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I took a trip to Europe as a younger person, and I had only so many rolls of film and so much money that I could budget for developing them. And so it did. It made me slow down and think more about what I was taking.
Yeah.
And then I invited people over, and we looked at the albums that I created or the slideshows on the wall.
Yeah.
It was a little more of an event.
Yeah.
Something that I notice is that these days, the photographer himself or herself is so much more likely to be the subject of the photograph. In other words, instead of saying, I'm going to show you that I was here by showing you what's here, I'm going to show you that I was here by showing you myself standing here.
Yeah. There's photographers out there now that they're not celebrities because of what they're photographing. They're celebrities because they're photographing themselves. It's almost about transmitting what you are rather than what you see.
Or feel.
Yeah.
And what is that doing to photography as an art form?
It's actually more a storytelling. I'm more a stills photographer than a lot of people are doing both now. And I have a lot of trouble actually doing both.
And by both you mean stills and video?
Stills and video, yeah. It's an interesting one. Occasionally I'll dabble in it and have virtually no success in it. I know where my place is. And I think Francie is more of both. I don't see the world in motion. I see it in stills.
And why do you see it in motion?
I don't know if I see it in motion. I just think that it's, like Allan always says, you have to use the equipment that we have available. And in the old days, you had 12 plates. Now we have our cell phones. Let's use them and let's share the emotion that we're feeling. And I think that's part of the whole social media thing. And I think it has pros and cons. Maybe there are issues with it, and it does create a different world because we want to see everything through social media. But I think there is a place for that technology in art. I mean, art has to evolve. There's no point wanting it to be like when Ansel Adams was around because we're not at that point anymore.
Right.
We have to evolve. It's like language. I mean, English changes daily. New words are created. So it's that flexibility of the technology and of your tools that allows people to be more creative. And I think it's wonderful that the average man on the street can express some form of creativity through social media if that's his only platform. Because not everybody can have a gallery. and print their own work. I mean, we learn through other people's stories. I don't particularly like Facebook, but I enjoy Instagram because it has given me insight into people that I would normally not connect with right here in Gunnison. And I watch people do things in Russia and India and other places that I'll probably never get to actually go there myself, but I can share that moment with them.
And from a human point of view, I find that interesting because what people post, not whether it's art or not, but just what they choose to post about themselves and their world and their life and what they're doing, is in itself really revealing about humanity and where we are and what stories matter and what stories don't. That's a very interesting perspective to me because you hear a lot of moaning and groaning about social media and, the negative impacts that it has. But there's a lot of good.
There is some good, for sure.
Yeah. Well, finish up by speaking to that group of people in the audience. They've got a camera in their pocket. They've been taking a lot of pictures, but they'd really like to take that next step. They'd like to make art. What advice do you give them? Where do they start?
I think they need to create a final product that's not just digital. When people actually take the image from their cell phone and put it onto a piece of canvas or a piece of metal, that is a hugely rewarding process. Not enough people do that, I don't think. And we do it for people. So it's really interesting to see when someone creates something on their phone and they'll come into the gallery. And a lot of people don't realize what quality of image they can actually reproduce from a phone. And when they see it on a piece of metal or a piece of canvas, it's like, wow, this is amazing.
There it is in the world now.
Yeah.
Well, it's just pixels. It's not quite...
It's almost not real. Whereas when you put it on something tangible and you can hold it in your hands and feel it, that's what I would recommend.
What about you, Francie?
Yeah, I think watching people's reactions when they come and pick up their work that we've printed for them, the whole body language changes, from when they bring their phone and say, do you think this will print okay? And we always double check. Allan always makes sure it will. And then we say yes, and they come and get it a few days later. Just the emotional expressions that we see from people, it's valuable.
And in that moment, they've taken a step toward becoming an artist because from now on, they're going to be thinking about it. When they take a photo, will this look good on the wall?
Yeah.
Well, that, and also how is that going to look on the canvas? And then they start thinking about probably a little bit more about composition, about the colors, that sort of thing.
And from there, once you've decided that that's what you want to do, the world is full of resources of how to learn something about composition and color and all of those things.
Yeah, it's almost infinite.
Allan, Francie, thanks for what you do.
It's a pleasure.
Bringing the world and making it stand still for us, places and people. And thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
ThinkRadio is a production of Allan Wardis Media. To contact Allan, visit allanwardismedia.com.
The show's producer is Issa Forrest. Original music by Issa Forrest. Thanks for listening. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio.